Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN Sunday for Sunday, March 14th, 2021. I'm going to be joined today by members of the media, academia, and financial services as we analyze all the news and information this week in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more. We've got another great show, great contributors, great guests, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of BRN Sunday. Let's kick things off as we tend to always do with a look at technology. Joining us online, he's lead advisor and executive producer for 7 Investing, Daniel Klein. Dan, great to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for joining us on the program.
And I am a non-fungible guest, Jeff. Irreplaceable.
Yeah, I wish I knew what when you say fungible, and we'll have to go into definitions for the audience, because when I think of fungible, I think of fungi. I think of mushrooms. I think of toe fungus. So, I know you wanted to start off with a talk about non-fungible tokens. What are non-fungible tokens, Dan?
So, Jeff, this is something I'm going to come off and act like I'm an expert on that I heard about 3 weeks ago. But I've since done multiple shows on it, done a lot of research. A non-fungible token is a limited edition digital piece that's trackable like cryptocurrency. So let's pretend you and I, the audience, the BRN audience, really wants to see the two of us in person together. So when we're both vaccinated, we fly to someplace, we record a video together, and we decide we're going to sell 1,000 copies of this, and members can buy it. We're not going to do this. I'm just picking a ridiculous example. Sure. So we do this. People buy it. Maybe we charge $100. Well, this becomes an asset for those people, and when they sell it again, because it's all on sort of the same exchange, we get some money for it. So we make money the first time, then we make a small piece every time it trades hands. So it's a trackable asset, and it's a collectible. It has real value. Think of it like a limited edition print of a painting. So how is this being used? How can it be used? I think it's a game changer in the music space. So streaming has made it very hard to make a living as a musician because there's no real reason to own a CD or a vinyl album. Like, maybe Taylor Swift still sells 1 million copies of a physical album, but her fans aren't buying it because they're playing it. They're buying it as a souvenir. Yeah. So imagine if an artist, and I'm thinking about some of the smaller artists that I like that maybe have 20 or 30,000 diehard fans, and they could say, okay, we're making our new album, and if you'd like to buy it as an NFT, well, the first 100 people who pay $30 for it not only get a vinyl copy, they also get their name in the liner notes. People who pay $1,000, they get to hear the album 2 weeks early. People who pay $5,000 can have lunch with the band. People who pay $10,000, and there's only 2 of these available, can have a backyard concert with the band. And all of a sudden, it's sort of taking the crowdfunding model, but really putting it in control of the artist. So, there's all sorts of weird uses of this, and like Gronk is having someone do artistic renderings of his best Super Bowl moments. This is Rob Gronkowski, and then you'll be able to buy them. And of course, this has created a whole collectibles market. Twitter is auctioning off the first tweet as an NFT, and it's up to like $3 million in terms of bids. Now, here's the problem. Collectibles are generally not an investment. If you invested in Barry Bonds rookie cards back when those were valuable, you feel pretty dumb now because they're not worth very much, if anything. If you have a closet full of Beanie Babies...
Oh, I was just thinking about Beanie Babies, Dan. I was just thinking about when you were talking about that. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
So I think most of the NFT market, there will be some high-end collectibles. There will be some things that people consider priceless or irreplaceable or whatever it is. But there's also going to be a lot of like what I consider like the Funko Pop model. If you buy a Funko Pop of Steve Carell from The Office, you're not investing in that. You're buying it because you want to put it on your desk, and your statement is, "I enjoyed The Office." Like I have an R2-D2 that's somewhere on my desk here. I'm not seeing it, but somewhere there's an R2-D2. I didn't buy that because someday it might be more valuable. I bought it because it's a collectible. I think a lot of NFTs are going to be artists connecting with their fans, and there will be some portion. The NBA has been making hundreds of thousands of dollars in this very new market selling highlights as NFTs. So if you want digital rights to some famous dunk, maybe they're only selling 500 copies of it or whatever it is. And that doesn't mean it won't air on TV, but you'll own something that nobody else can own, and it's limited, and it is in theory a saleable, transferable asset. So we're in the very early days of this. But Jeff, anything could theoretically be an NFT. So you might do a a promotion with one of your advertisers where maybe they sell NFTs to get, a specific piece of retirement advice from some noted expert, or maybe
Hmm.
for charity, Warren Buffett will give his thoughts on something, and sell it as an NFT. So it's a wild, wild west, but it's also a brand new world that has lots of possibilities.
Well, I like the fact that you can reward. Look, I like it in principle because you can reward those artists, right? It's really hard. I'm not a professional musician, but I play music, as you know, and it's really hard to make your name, especially, you've got The Voice, American Idol, but a lot of people don't, for every one that gets on there, what they're like 100 or what, or 1,000 people that don't get on there, really hard to make a living. So I really like it. Dan, in practice, though, it's, as you said, Wild West. I'm just kind of leery when you brought up the Beanie Baby thing. That's immediately I was thinking of, and I'm like, remember people used to run around to try to get the Super Beanie Baby, and they were thinking, or even back to Cabbage Patch Kids, right? They were going out there. I'm really dating myself now, going out to get the latest thing. That just seems like, in my mind,
Yeah.
a waste of money. That's dangerous. We want to make sure that people don't, as you said, they're investing. They're not
So
throwing
I
money
don't
away.
I don't view this as an investment, and I'll give a real life example. So my favorite band is a Boston band, Buffalo Tom, and their last album, that they're not full time musicians anymore, and their last album they used a service called Pledge Music to crowdfund it. I'm pretty sure Pledge Music doesn't exist anymore. So you could go and you could pay $10 for a digital copy of the album, maybe 20 got you a physical copy, maybe 30 got you mentioned in the liner notes, but there was a middleman. The artist didn't get most, they got most of the money, but there was still a big chunk taken out. In theory, with a blockchain based NFT, they can do the same type of thing and make significantly more money. So I think this takes something and it kind of democratizes the art world because
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if you have 20,000 fans, you can grind it out. I like another small band called Nada Surf, and they play 200 gigs a year in order to make a living and put out albums to a relatively small fan base and grind it out. Well, what if they could monetize that fan base much more efficiently and not have to spend 200 nights a year crammed in a hotel room or in a van or whatever it is?
Mm.
I think it's going to make a lot of artists that really couldn't make a living or had to do had to teach lessons or do alternative jobs to be artists really focus and spend full time. Are they going to be millionaires? Probably not, but might it be more the equivalent of, yeah, if you could put out an album and hustle 100,000 copies, that was a nice living. I think that might be more possible. And even comedians and artists like painters and other, there's just so many areas where this can be something. We've joked about, we could make the 7 Investing Picks an NFT as an alternate way to sell our content subscription. Probably not something we'd ever do, but really anything. I joked yesterday, what if I hired Mr. T to do
Ah.
other people's catchphrases and then sold them as NFTs? Like, it's really whatever people would be interested in. But
Mm.
look, would it be fun to have Mr. T, doing, saying dynamite? Yes, that would be fun. Would I pay $20 for it? Maybe. Is it an investable asset? No, it is not.
Yeah, you're dating yourself with Dynamite. That was a great show, by the way. All right, let's.
Dating myself with Mr. T.
Oh, that's true. I pity the fool. All right, Dan, let's switch gears. Let's talk a little Peloton-esque. There's I think a Sam's Club bike, or someone is rolling out a big box store. Let's put it this way: is rolling out a bike, an exercise bike that is like the Peloton, but not as pricey as the Peloton. That sounds like a good deal to me already.
So Sam's Club is selling an $800 Echelon bike. Echelon is one of the somewhat well-known Peloton competitors. They offer a similar array of classes. People will argue that Peloton has the best classes and the best teachers. That might be true. I can't imagine it's all that different, having been to lots of gyms over the years. But that being said, the entry-level Peloton is about $1,900. This bike sold at Sam's Club, which is an Echelon bike, and I haven't been on it, but I've seen other Echelon bikes, and they are reviewed well. If a Peloton's an A, this is a solid B. Not only are you getting the bike for $800, you're getting 6 months of classes free, which is a $39.99 a month purchase with your Peloton. So there's really heavy value here, and I would argue that the people who are buying a Peloton for status, the person who has to have an iPhone, not because they think the iPhone is better, but because they worry that that's the premier brand, that's not, that person's still going to buy a Peloton. But I have some friends that own $1,500 Nordic tracks and that own other comparable products. that probably would have bought this had it existed. So I don't think it cannibalizes the Peloton market, but I do think it brings the concept of connected fitness to more people. And the negative being, if you've only spent $800, if you got the 6 months of classes for free, it makes it that much easier for it to go the route of a traditional exercise bike, and you made the purchase, and then it becomes a clothes rack in your house. But I think this is going to get a lot more people on connected fitness. The internet doesn't agree, by the way. Twitter is not happy with me for this.
Well, the hell with Twitter. They get it. They got a lot of stuff wrong, and there's only 140 characters or 280 characters, whatever the character limit is now. Dan, I look. The more people that are exercising, I want to step back for a minute, because the more people that are exercising, the healthier they're going to be. If they do it through connected fitness, if they buy one package or another, that's good. If they like I kind of align it to like Apple. People who really like Apple are going to buy Apple products. People who don't like Apple or can't afford to buy Apple aren't going to buy Apple. They're going to buy something else. So I think there obviously are different tiers. Consumers have all different tastes. But the bottom line for me is that it's another way for people to get connected, to do the things you're suggesting, and get exercise. And look, what I think is a good exercise trainer might be different than your perspective, Dan, or might be different than my mom's perspective, etc. So I think that's in the eye of the beholder. I'll give you the last word on this, though.
Yeah, it is. And the one piece of this that I think people are getting wrong is people think that gyms are going to be long term hurt by this. I don't think that's the case. I think post pandemic, when it's safe to be in a gym, all these people who own a Peloton are going to use their Peloton 3, 4, even 5 times a week, but they're still going to want to go to a gym. Because, Jeff, you're stuck in the house. When you get on your rower, 6, 7 days a week, that gets boring. Like, you want to, like, people are going to go to a gym because there is a diversity of it. So
Yeah.
I actually think a lot of different companies can win. And it wouldn't shock me if this Echelon bike is a hit for Sam's Club. I'm not sure it's really taking away Peloton customers. Might be taking away Nordic Track or other competitor customers that sort of had a mid-tier price point.
Yeah, well, like for me, the diversity is not in the exercise; it's in seeing other people. Right now, I'm looking down at my beautiful black cat named Sebastian, who is begging me for something to eat. Dan, we're going to leave it there as always, and we're going to look forward to seeing you on the show on Tuesday. Now we're going to talk a little bit about 3D printing and myheritage.com. I think is something we're going to talk about. So looking forward to talking to you again then.
Jeff, we'll see you then.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Now time to talk healthcare. Joining us on the line, she is the healthcare editor for Business Insider. Welcome to the program, Lydia Ramsey Flanzer. Lydia, great to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning. I was like, I was introducing you, and all of a sudden my mind went numb. I don't know if I'm having cognitive decline or what, so I apologize. But, I think our listeners are very familiar with you, and I'm hoping they're very familiar with your work, and they should check out Dispensed. I forgot to mention that again, but Dispensed is a great newsletter that Lydia and the team put together each and every week to kind of wrap up the news in healthcare. So Lydia, what kind of percolates your interest this week from the pages of Dispensed?
Sure. Yeah. The biggest thing I think that's on people's minds is just there's a lot of optimism in the air. Biden yesterday gave a 1-year anniversary of announcing the pandemic address, and in it he said that he wants to make it so all adults in the U.S. are eligible to receive the vaccine starting May 1st. So that means that everyone is eligible, but it doesn't mean necessarily that everyone will have a shot by the end of April.
Right.
So, but it's still exciting because I think, I don't know, personally, I was hoping to get a shot by August. But so it's exciting to hear it might be happening sooner. And the other big news coming out of like the national level is that the CDC came out with guidance about what vaccinated people can do. And it's all great news, right? You get to hug your relatives. You get to be inside without masks. It's definitely, this pandemic isn't really going anywhere, but it's really encouraging to see just how much these vaccines are playing a role in getting us to a better spot.
Yeah. Are we seeing a correlation between the vaccine dosages being taken and the decline in the ultimate coronavirus? Because not everyone, as you said, not everyone is eligible. Not everyone is getting one, but hopefully they'll be eligible by May 1st. But are we seeing overall, and I guess I'm talking more in the U.S., not necessarily internationally, but it'd be good to know if you have it. Are we seeing a decline overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a component. You see like cases dropping from their really, really highs in December. And that was like largely a part of people were congregating together, even though they weren't supposed to, and there was a lot of components driving spread, weather was bad. So people were hanging out inside versus out. But definitely, we've seen pretty straightforward drops in cases in places like nursing homes, where huge chunks of their populations have been vaccinated from a worker and resident perspective.
Yeah.
So it's really encouraging. I think we'll start to see more of an impact as more people get vaccinated. I would expect once we get to a place where a third of people are vaccinated, hopefully we counter the kind of question mark still these days is what the variants do as they keep spreading around the U.S. Will they make this worse?
And in terms of this, I guess all the jury's out, right? Because there's not enough data to kind of suggest whether it's going to go one way or the other. But still, people need to be prepared and mask up if you're not vaccinated, and even if you are vaccinated, you should be protecting yourself and others. What in terms of the CDC guidance? So earlier in the week, we had someone on from AAA, Jeanette Castellano-McGee, talking about it's going to be a whole new paradigm of travel. But what in terms of that CDC guidance, maybe not just travel, but I guess we can hug people, shake hands if you're vaccinated. Anything else that kind of strikes you as interesting in terms of some of that guidance, and is it very detailed?
Yeah, I think it's very cautious still for now. To your point about travel, they definitely haven't said strongly, hey, definitely get on a plane and do it. I think a lot of people are reading into that, but it is pretty conservative. I would expect this is draft one. I think we saw mask guidance change over time. We still are seeing it change. I would expect vaccinated folks guidance for them will change too as we learn more. Especially the big piece of this is transmission. To your point, we don't know, the studies that we've seen don't account for transmission. They look at, did someone get sick who has had the vaccine? It didn't specify, did someone give someone else the virus when they were vaccinated? So once we start to know a little bit more about transmission and how it's working, I think that would really, assuming it's good news, that'll really loosen things up.
And Lydia, before the pandemic, as a healthcare reporter, you traveled to different conferences and events, kind of highlighting the latest technology, biotech, latest things going on in healthcare. Are you seeing, just anecdotally, things kind of pick up from a conference perspective in your space? I mean, if I'm in the retirement space and we have a lot of conferences, and I'm seeing some planning potentially for the end of the year, but how about in your world? Are you seeing potentially more conferences pop up other than virtual conferences, because they can do those anywhere?
Right. Yeah, I haven't yet. I think someone tentatively invited me to something in September, and the idea really freaked me out. But maybe I'll have to start changing my mindset back to that. So I'll be curious. I think a lot of places did postpone big gatherings, and that's part of the CDC guidance. It says I think it's mid and large gatherings should still be avoided. So until that starts to change, I wouldn't expect to see huge, massive 10,000 people events happening just yet.
Yeah, and I was watching a hockey game last night. I saw that there were some fans. It was the Capitals versus the Washington Capitals versus the Philadelphia Flyers. They actually had some fans in the arena. I had to do a double take. I was like, oh my gosh, they're actually fans. And I've been reading that in some Major League Baseball parks, for example, they may have some appearances. But again, you need to take the precautions, right? They're going to space people out. It's not going to be 100% capacity, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Lydia, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. And I didn't give it enough of a push when we started off, but everyone should really check out Lydia's and the team's Dispense. It's a great piece. I look at it on a regular basis, and it's a great consolidation of all the news. Lydia, always a pleasure. Enjoy your weekend, the rest of your weekend, I should say, and we'll chat with you again very soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about markets and also cryptocurrency, all the rage these days. And joining us now, he is the co-founder of Delphi Digital Cryptocurrency Research Firm. Let's welcome to the program Kevin Kelly. Kevin, great to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.
Well, it's always a pleasure talking with you, and I love the fact that you can wear multiple hats at the same time. You just, it's like a switch. Markets, crypto, because of your background as an equity strategist. Let's start off with markets. We had, I think, a big week in the markets. Now we're recording this. It's 9 o'clock a.m. Eastern time before the markets opens on Friday, the 12th. But up to this point, the markets have had a good run. We have a COVID relief bill seems to have been signaling some nice things to the market. The markets responded accordingly. How did you and the folks at Delphi see it?
Yeah, no, I certainly think, a couple things top of mind this week. One, obviously being, as you mentioned, the large, quite large fiscal stimulus package that wound up getting approved. And now that we're going to have more money in the pockets of average Americans, I certainly think, it's interesting. You've got this combination of, a slow but improving economic recovery. A lot of the data is actually coming in much better than people expected initially or had anticipated. You just had some data out that U.S. net household net worth just hit a new all-time high, and at the same time, you now have this, nearly $2 trillion stimulus package. It's essentially going to be a good portion of it injected right into the economy. So, to be honest, it's one of those situations where it's pretty difficult to argue against a kind of a more liquid background, a more liquidity coming into this market that certainly can boost or I guess prop up stocks and certainly the crypto market here in the short to medium term. And what that means on the flip side is, and you've seen this start to play out, and we've mentioned this quite a few times on your program, but you've really started to see it play out in the last 2 or 3 weeks or so, is this kind of anti-bond rhetoric, right? As you see economic growth improving, as you expect inflation, or I should say inflation expectations are rising, that really kind of makes the argument for bonds a tough one to swallow right now, especially when you're getting, as we've talked about, 1.5, 1.6, percent yield on a U.S. 10-year Treasury note. It just makes the argument for bonds a little bit tough right now. Not to say that you shouldn't have it, and it's not a great portfolio, diversifier, but certainly expect bonds to continue to underperform for the short to medium term.
Kevin, what about inflation? Has that been, we've seen a rise in gas prices, but I guess that's kind of expected with the horrible storm in Texas, the contraction of supply. People are driving a little bit more now that states are starting to reopen or resume activities. But aside from gas prices, inflation, is that tempered a little bit? Are we going to see a rise in inflation? Because typically what happens when you have a lot of money flush into a system economically, and again, I'm not an economist, but I've read enough economists. I've talked to 13 of them, and they've all had 13 different opinions. But when you have a lot of money chasing too few goods, you tend to get inflation. What about some of the inflation prognostications you've been reading and hearing about?
Yeah, I mean, you had the most recent reading on CPI actually earlier this week came in a bit below expectations.
Okay.
But to be honest, all the reasons you mentioned, more money and liquidity flowing into the market and flowing into potentially household goods, but also as the global economy comes back online and continues to improve, you do have some transitory or temporary supply shortage kind of bottlenecks that by pretty much every estimate has to eventually feed into these kind of raw CPI numbers, right? And that's a very common inflation gauge that people track. Somebody actually, I got a kick out of this. Somebody actually tweeted yesterday about how they jokingly said, I guess all the things that I enjoy in life aren't tracked in CPI because, again, there's a lot of different kind of consumer goods
Yep.
and actually food prices and things of that nature that have started to kind of pick up, I guess you could say, in terms of prices. But yeah, no, I mean, the big debate is this a long-term kind of inflationary shift, or we're getting into a new inflationary regime, or is it short-term? And if you actually look at what we call break-even rates, and you can look at these on 5 or 10-year periods, and essentially what they are common proxies for inflation expectations. 5-year expectations for inflation are actually higher than 10-year, which is really interesting. So it's almost like an inverted inflation curve right now. And basically what that tells you is all the things we just talked about, short to medium, we'll call it medium term over the next few years. Yes, you could have some of these temporary or transitory inflationary pressures build and actually show up in some of the hard numbers. But the kind of structural outlook for inflation, right, and this idea of technology and a whole bunch of things that are feeding into this broader, longer-term deflationary narrative certainly still holds. So it's a really kind of interesting dynamic where, again, you're a long-term portfolio, your asset allocation is long-term oriented. there's certain ways in which you can kind of shift that around as you enter different periods or different regimes of inflation. But, by and large, it's interesting, even just from a strategist standpoint, because you're starting to see actually within markets and within asset prices, the duration, I guess you'd say, of inflation, when that actually shows up, is actually starting to come through in the actual data itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I should add that you always forget this on your intro, but you are a chartered financial analyst, CFA designation, and I should have said that in your intro. My apologies. Kevin, let's switch gears now, talk about crypto, because we've been talking about this quite some time on our show. I know you do it on your podcast and in other venues as well. You've seen Bitcoin really, I think, make a run up to 60,000, if I'm not mistaken. We've seen some ebb and flow. Lots of news out of the cryptocurrency marketplace. What's your take?
Yeah, so Bitcoin hovering right now around 58,000. If you get to that, it hit about 60,000, almost 60,000 was this most recent high. And so I think, one, if you get a break to 60,000 or above, I think that's kind of all bets are off, and it's going to be another leg higher for Bitcoin, and that applies to the rest of the crypto market. You are starting to see, though, a lot of activity happening in these other kind of subsectors that we've talked about. DeFi was a really decentralized finance has been a really kind of hot sector for the better part of a year now. But you're also starting to see a lot of activity hover around these things called NFTs that I'm sure at this point some people have certainly it's come across the radar, these non-fungible tokens. And so in the short term, I think like any type of new technology or new asset class, you're going to see prices kind of get out ahead of themselves, right, or a little bit over their skis in terms of some of the prices you're actually seeing for digital art and NBA Top Shots and things like this that are going for these days. But over the long term, I actually think NFTs are going to be a huge secular trend towards, again, just different ways in which you can use this as, let's say, you're a creator or you're a newsletter writer or whatever, or what have you. There's going to be so many interesting ways in which you can use NFTs in your kind of day-to-day business that I think it's going to actually help reshape and improve, existing business models. So it's definitely a sector to watch out for. If you are in the art game, check out some of this digital art and see if it's something that's potentially valuable to you. But I think there's a lot of things that are being built around this space, and the infrastructure is being built around this space that's going to make these very, very usable and very honestly mainstream, probably within the next 5 to 10 years. It's just, again, one of those kind of hype cycles in the short term where I think prices potentially could be getting a little ahead of themselves right now.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. We talked earlier in the show with Daniel Klein of Seven Investing. He's got that huge technology background. He brought up NFTs as it relates to not only art but musicians. And we brought up Beanie Babies. I don't know if you remember Beanie Babies, but they were all the rage, I guess, in the 90s, and people were like stepping all over each other to get the in Beanie Baby, and it never really materialized into a collectible. Maybe it was a valuable asset, but it was something that maybe you kept on your shelf. How do you see? Do you see the NFT marketplace? How does it relate? Let me ask you this, and simply, how does it relate to cryptocurrency? Does the tokenization use the underlying blockchain technology, and now you are essentially buying that token and can apply that token anywhere? Is that how it works?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, a really good point. So NFTs actually use the underlying blockchain technology, and so what the big difference between those are, and without getting too into the kind of technical weeds, you think about a big smart contract platform like Ethereum, right, which we've talked about on the show before. What the fungible tokens are, these ERC20s, that's a standard Ethereum standard. Basically what that means is those are kind of fungible, right? It's like the US dollars, like Bitcoin, 1 equals 1, and you can use those in different ways. The non-fungible aspect uses a different standard on Ethereum that basically makes it so that you can't just randomly mint these or create more. Each one has unique identifiers. So you talk about the musical artist example earlier. One of the things that was really cool that came out this week is a group called Disclosure Musical Artist. And what they basically did is they created a 1-for-1 NFT, right? So there's only one that exists today, probably only one that's ever going to exist. And the owner of that NFT will actually be able to get, I believe it's 3 or 4 tickets to any Disclosure show pretty much indefinitely for as long as they hold this NFT. And so whoever is the owner of that can go and claim for free tickets to any disclosure show. So if you think about you as a fan, right? I'm a huge Dave Matthews fan, for example, right? If I was able to get and buy, let's say, one of 1,000 Dave Matthews NFTs, and what that gave me was not only, concert access, but maybe it gives me a discount on merchandise. There's so many different benefits and perks. Maybe it's a live, AMA with Dave and the rest of the band, and there's only 1,000 of us that can join it, right? Again, in COVID times, this whole kind of move to virtual makes things a bit different. But if you think 5-10 years from now, we're kind of all back and going to live shows and really kind of participating in these experiences, there's some really cool experiences you can create with these things.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And, I'm not a huge Dave Matthews fan, but I like the band, and I'm a Grateful Dead fan. And obviously they're not around, but there's different components of the Grateful Dead still around. But
a lot of overlap in those groups, too.
Oh, yeah, a lot of them. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I've got a bunch of buddies who are both huge Deadheads, but also huge Dave fans. So.
Yeah, it's great music. But you're
right.
Music. But it's great music. But I think the point that you're making, one of the points that you're making is that if you're an artist, this is another way to make money. And it's because it's tough to look. As Dan was saying earlier in the show, it's tough to get out on the road, to sell out, to go to a gig, 250 shows, 200 nights a year, whatever it is, and you're only playing that 50 to 100 people. It's hard to make a living that way. This provides another way for you as Kevin Kelly or Jeff Snyder to say, I like somebody and I want this and I'm going to get a little bit more access. So I think it's a great idea, and I'm hoping that a lot of people will benefit from this.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, as you start to see these become more kind of commonplace, I think you'll actually have, and you're starting to see, as I mentioned, the infrastructure is being built out in marketplaces to buy and sell and trade these things. Right now, I mean, when you talk about price discovery and price efficiency, what, for example, going back to that disclosure, musical artist example, what is the proper quote unquote intrinsic value of a marketplace price of something like that? It's extremely subjective, right? Me, I'm a fan of that group, but I'm not necessarily, a top fan that's going to go out and pay $5, $6, maybe even $10,000 for that, right? But if you have a huge fan who's wants the exclusive access, you have this whole secular shift towards more kind of experiences over, actual consumer goods purchases, and you plan on seeing this group disclosure for, I don't know, call it 10, 15 years, right? I mean, it could actually make sense for you. So point being, a lot of what's being talked about kind of in financial media is around the actual prices of some of this stuff getting sold. And while, again, I think some of these prices have certainly got ahead of themselves, to come out and say that something subjectively shouldn't have value, I just think a lot of people are kind of talking out, are kind of blowing smoke around a lot of this stuff, because, again, by definition, somebody might value this at $10,000 where I value it at $10, right? It's all about how you're going to use it, and subjectively, what you put on it as kind of an internal intrinsic value, if that makes sense.
Well, you're one person, Kevin, that never blows smoke. At least not on this. At least not on this show. And I will just say to you, what would you say, Kevin Kelly? That's my Dave Matthews imitation. Kevin Kelly, it's always a pleasure chatting with you, and I wish you a great, wonderful weekend. I'm sorry we lost an hour, but we'll talk to you again very soon.
Sounds great, Jeff. Have a good one, man.
Bye. Welcome back. Now time to talk a little real estate. Joining us online, he is the real estate reporter for Market Watch. Welcome to the program, Jacob Passy. Jacob, great to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
So I think last week we chatted, and it looks like mortgage rates were creeping up. I think they got to 3% for the first time in 6 months. And it looks like that trend, if I'm not mistaken, has continued. So before we get there, what's top of mind for you this week besides mortgage rates in terms of real estate? I should have asked you that first.
Yeah, so I did a story this week looking at so the stimulus bill passed both houses of Congress last weekend and was signed into law by President Biden, the American Rescue Plan, and it included around almost $22 billion in emergency rental assistance, which is great. And this is the second batch of emergency rental assistance that's been passed by Congress. Back in December, they passed $25 billion. And as you and I have talked, as folks are aware, there's a major crisis going on in the rental market right now. Millions of people still can't afford to pay their monthly rent. There is a national moratorium on evictions. So landlords are struggling because they can't collect rent payments because folks can't pay, but they also can't evict per se. So not a great situation for renters or landlords alike, and this assistance is sorely needed. But my story actually looked at the batch of housing aid that was passed in December and what happened to it. And what happened to it is it didn't really get out there yet. And so there was kind of, not to get too into the weeds for listeners, but it's kind of a weird bureaucratic situation that happened where basically the Treasury Department is in control of distributing those funds to states and local governments. And they put out, on the last day of the Trump administration put out guidelines for what state and local housing finance agencies, nonprofits needed to do to verify whether or not landlords and tenants were eligible for assistance. But consumer advocates and state and local governments immediately raised concerns because the guidelines that the Trump administration put out on January 19th went above and beyond what the law required. So they were basically requiring more proof of eligibility than the law specified. And there was a concern basically that folks wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, they were saying that, tenants needed to provide documentation of lost income, things like that, things that people might not have access to. And so, what good is the aid if it's not going to get to the people who need it most? So, concerns were raised the next day, literally the next day, the Biden administration took office, and the new, Biden administration revised that guidance, but it took them a month to do it. So they didn't put out the new guidelines until late February. And what happened in that meantime is that all these agencies who got their money, they got their money in January. By law, they were required, the Treasury Department was required to distribute those funds. But basically all of these, rental assistance agencies across the country were just sitting on the money, not able to do anything with it because they didn't know what they needed to do for verification purposes. So really, it's only in the last couple weeks that we've seen any of these agencies, start to distribute those funds once they were able to read over the new guidelines from the Biden administration and ensure that their program met what was required. So it's great that more aid was passed, but the aid that was already, distributed, that has not made its way fully out to people yet. And this is all concerning because the eviction moratorium is currently set to end at the end of the month. The Biden administration might extend it, but it's seen legal challenges. There's a couple federal judges at this point who have ruled that the moratorium is unconstitutional. So, it's unclear, how much longer it will be able to withstand, those legal challenges. And consumer advocates are worried because the money is not out there yet and people really need it now. So time's running out. So we'll have to keep an eye on the rental market. But hope is here, but maybe it's a little too late.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this all year, you and I and others, in terms of people who desperately need assistance, can't get assistance for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't have enough income or they had too much income. So it's kind of disappointing that if aid was delivered, money was delivered, it wasn't distributed. And I guess I understand that the guidance maybe was a little bit restrictive. Hopefully now that things have been, more money has been delivered, now more money can find its way to both renters and landlords, because we don't want to forget the landlords in this either, Jacob, right? I mean, a lot of them are small mom and pop or, smaller businesses that are just maybe having one or two rental properties, and they need some financial support too. They need those rental payments in order to keep the property, make payments on their mortgage.
Totally. I mean, in the single-family rental market, single-family homes that are for rent, over half of those are owned by small mom-and-pop landlords, not major corporations or anything like that. And they're struggling. I mean, they have their own bills and taxes to pay, and if they don't have rental income, I mean, small mom-and-pop landlords don't necessarily have the savings or the, access to capital that, like, private equity firms have. So, the larger corporations, are probably doing, I don't want to say that they're doing great. I mean, it's
sure.
a financial hardship for them for sure, but they have resources that someone who owns maybe just one or two second homes that they decided to rent out, those people don't have the same resources. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to all those homes in the coming months. I wouldn't be surprised if we were to start to see some of those landlords decide to get out of Dodge and sell those homes to some of these larger firms and recoup what they've lost.
Yeah, and it seems like that's kind of happened in some of the commercial real estate. You've had what they call, I guess, distressed buying, right, where people can't make payments and then they get gobbled up. I think you and I spoke about, or maybe it was, I don't remember. I think it was you and I, maybe some of these tech companies coming in and buying properties in New York City, the Facebooks and the Googles of the world getting property, and maybe this is another example of that. But it is important to ensure that the aid gets, if it was earmarked for people, it needs to get there, and for both renters and landlords, because you're right. A lot of these are small business owners, small. They're not making zillions of dollars, and they're renting properties. Last question for you, Jacob. What's the rental market look like? I mean, you live in the New York City tri-state area. Is the rental market soft in some of these metro areas because of the pandemic? Or are we seeing things start to kind of go back up, or in terms of rents?
Yeah, the rental market is still a little soft in some of the larger metro areas, especially the higher priced metro areas. The New Yorks and San Franciscos still have a bit of softness to them. That's not necessarily the case, in the suburbs. And that's like one interesting thread is, I think there's been this overarching narrative that rents are down nationwide. They're not quite. I mean, in some of, some of the cities that have become really hot in recent years, Nashville, places like that, rents are not necessarily down. And then when you look to the suburbs and single family homes for rent, those rents are still pretty strong, because because a lot of people fled the cities but didn't necessarily buy. They may have just left the city to rent out in the suburbs and get more space. So, I don't want to, that being said, I think that as things are opening up, as vaccinations are improving, there is, New York is not dead.
Yeah, sure.
It's changed for sure, but it's not dead. People are coming back. The longer term question that's out there right now, though, is probably more so the case on the West Coast. Some of those really high-priced markets like San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, there's kind of an open question as to how they can continue to justify those prices in light of the adoption of remote work. And so, while in the shorter term, maybe midterm, they'll be fine, there are questions for their long-term sustainability of those prices, because a lot of those workers who are, a lot of workers in those cities are renters. And to the extent that those folks work at tech firms and other companies that have embraced remote working, they don't necessarily need to live in those cities anymore. Time will only tell if some of those companies decide to say, you know what, we want you back in the office, because there are benefits to collaboration and things like that. But I think there is a general sense that a lot of those companies will allow people to work remotely indefinitely. And it'll be interesting to see where those people go, because these are folks who can afford those high rents, and they may go to cities across the country. They may move to other cities like Sacramento, Phoenix, Boise, et cetera. And it'll be curious to see what happens to the rents in those cities after they move, because some of those people won't necessarily want to buy. They may not want to live in those different locations long term. They just want to, get a change of scenery, save a little bit of money. But saving money for them is very different, looks very different, because they're already used to paying, $4,000 a month, et cetera. So, they might end up just driving up even higher costs of rent in these, second and third tier cities in terms of population, which will have a negative effect on renters who were already living in those cities. And where will those people go? And what will happen to the rents in the cities that are left behind? So, I'll be curious to see what happens in the next few years. But I wouldn't jump to the conclusion just yet that, the rental markets are, in a lot of trouble in these major cities.
Yep. No, I think you're going to have a lot to write about, Jacob, post pandemic. You've had a lot to write about during the pandemic. You had a lot to write about before the pandemic too, but now you're going to have a lot because of all the things you're talking about, these unintended consequences and things, and how they're going to play out. This aid story, it's going to be interesting to see how this money gets earmarked and allocated to people, whether or not it's done efficiently and gets to the right people. Jacob Passy, always a pleasure chatting with you, and I wish you a great rest of the weekend and look forward to chatting with you again very soon.
Yeah, talk soon. Take care.
Bye-bye. Welcome back. Now time to take a look at what's going on Capitol Hill, and there's a lot going on these days. Joining me on the line, of course, are the Legal Eagles, better known as David Levine, Kevin Walsh. Of course, both are principals with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in good old Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Jeff, thank you for having us. It's great to be here. It's unfortunate that we are now celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic, but hopefully there will be some light at the end of the tunnel. And I think Kevin's going to try to keep it positive today. So on that note, I'll leave it over to my friend, Mr. Walsh, and for you to lead us through, Jeff.
Go for it. Thank you, David. Go ahead, Kev.
So, David, that was the all-time shortest intro you've ever done.
Well, okay. In that case, I want to talk about the incredible, amazing Dr. Cox. I mean, if any of you have watched Scrubs, that's the reference. Kevin has been likened to look like him. So I'm trying to burn as much of our segment talking about our lookalikes today.
Still chewing my cereal, but now my mouth is clear and I can talk without the great grain sound accompanying each word. But so yeah, this week I think we want to talk about environmental social governance investing. We haven't talked about it much in the past. I know these are just brand new concepts. Probably didn't come up all last year when there was rulemaking going on. May not have come up in December when these rules were finalized and went into effect. May not have even come up again in January when the Biden administration announced that they wanted to revisit these rules. Today, though, we've got an update because on Wednesday, the Labor Department issued, new sub-regulatory guidance related to ESG investing. And a point we're going to say for future weeks is we've got an interesting dynamic setting up where, it seems like the Labor Department is choosing not to enforce notice and comment rules, while at the same time they are enforcing, these secret sub-regulatory rules like missing participants.
Kevin. We promised for positive this week. This was the topic we talked about for a future week, because our listeners.
I'm positive. I'm positive that ESG changes are coming. I am positive that ESG changes are coming. Last week I may have been uncertain. This week I'm positive, and the reason I'm positive this week is because on Wednesday the Labor Department released this notice, which is an enforcement policy. Related to the financial factors rule, which is the ESG rule, as well as their proxy voting rule. And what this guidance said is, it said, notwithstanding the fact that these are final rules, notwithstanding the fact that we went through the APA to get these in place, we're not going to enforce them. We will not go after plan sponsors who make investments that don't comply with those rules.
Hey, Kevin, this is a real question for you. How do you do that? I will say, I think there's a widespread agreement amongst whether plan sponsors, fund creators, service providers, that maybe this is a good idea to pump the brakes on this. But at the same time, can you explain how it works that you do a suspension like this, like in a new administration?
Yeah, well, so technically the rule remains in effect. But what it comes down to is that in enforcement decisions, agencies have broad discretion. They've got a finite amount of resources, and they've got to pick what they're going to investigate. So an example is they could say, we're just having too much fun investigating missing participants. We're not going to have the time and energy to investigate ESG. We're not going to have the time and effort to investigate proxy voting. So in some way, they didn't tell us what their priorities are, but they said, it's not going to be a priority that we're going to look into these two things.
So it's priority by elimination. Is that what you're telling us?
It's prioritization by elimination. It's saying, hey, everybody, this won't be our priority. Like, that may be the rule, but we're not going to look for that. And, they get broad discretion to that because, agencies do have finite resources. On the other hand, they've also signaled that they're going to, be looking at making changes to the rule. So I think we're going to see a notice and comment period coming up in the not too distant future. But the one thing to bear in mind when you see a non-enforcement policy like this is that the agency can say it's not going to enforce the rule. That being said, it still is the rule. So there's some risk that you could see a private litigant, a private actor, a plan participant who's unhappy if a plan doesn't follow, the rule that's on the books, bring their own claim, make their own complaint about the action. So the government's kind of tied its own hands with respect to enforcement of this ESG rule that was fairly unpopular among plan sponsors and asset managers until the Biden administration gets its hands around, actually going through the normal regulatory process and making the changes that it thinks are appropriate to make. So David, that's about all that I can positively say today. Do you have anything you want to add?
Well, no, I think you make a very good point, Kevin. I think I'm going to tee us up for a future week very quickly. We're making lots of jokes here, but Kevin and I, we don't want to be one-trick ponies. So I think really what's going on here is I think there's a lot of support for revisiting ESG and proxy voting at this point. But at the same time, there's a real question out there right now about sort of how are things going to look in the Biden administration? Because clearly revisiting guidance is very normal course. Mm-hmm. But as we've talked before, you've got missing participants. We're going to be getting guidance on cybersecurity. This non-guidance guidance isn't going to be made by formal rulemaking. And I think that it could be fine, but there are some real concerns that it's basically going to be used as enforcement tools, even though there isn't actual guidance, which really raises a number of questions. And having lived through sort of the on-the-ground investigation work, where we have some experience that we want to say, how is this going to work as we go forward? Hopefully it does, but I think that's really what's lurking in our minds.
Well, gentlemen.
David, was that a way of saying, come back next week for a robust discussion about the different standards of deference owed to agency guidance, depending on how much notice and comment it goes through?
Jeff, I'm sorry we lost all our listeners.
Well, no, I got to say, Kevin, I'm amazed at how well you can breathe while you can breathe while you say all these long sentences. No, we did not lose our listeners, David. I think that we make a lot of jokes on the show, like to have fun. This is kind of dry sometimes, but really good points, especially for those plan sponsors, those employers, and even for people out there who are thinking about investing in ESG, putting in their retirement program. Lots to wrestle with, and that's why we do these types of segments. Gentlemen, I want to wish you a great rest of the week and enjoy the nice weather wherever you may be, and we'll talk to you again next week. Well, that wraps up this episode of BRN Sunday. I want to thank all of our great guests and contributors, and of course, thank you, the audience. Don't forget, we're back again tomorrow for BRN AM. I'll be joined by Johns Hopkins Medicine's Dr. Mike Blaha talking about cardiovascular health and aging. You're not going to want to miss that show. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.